Most of us believe we are free, navigating life according to our own choices. Yet, if we pause and look closely, the routines we accept without question reveal subtle chains we hardly notice. Waking up at a certain hour, checking notifications, performing tasks we must complete, these are not mere habits. They are tiny threads, carefully woven into the fabric of daily life, nudging us toward conformity without the sting of explicit orders. We obey, not because someone forces us with threats, but because the system has trained us to follow. The rituals of work, social expectation, and obligation create an invisible rhythm that guides our movements. Each small compliance, repeated day after day, deepens our sense of normalcy. For the reflective mind, recognizing these patterns can be unsettling. What feels like voluntary action may, in fact, be a silent form of servitude. Awareness is the first step, opening a door that most never even see. Friedrich Nietzsche often observed how society molds the majority into unquestioning followers, what he called the herd. He contrasted this with the few who rise above those who think, act, and create according to their own values. The herd does not rebel because it rarely recognizes the subtle chains binding it, accepting comfort and convention as natural. In modern life, these dynamics remain strikingly familiar. People follow routines, uphold norms, and defer to authority, often believing they are making independent choices. Yet Nietzsche would argue that this obedience is a form of psychological entrapment, a quiet surrender to external definitions of right and wrong. Recognizing this, the reflective observer can start to see how modern systems, workplaces, social hierarchies, and cultural expectations mirror the same herd-like pressures Nietzsche described. Understanding the philosophy is more than academic. It's a lens to see the invisible structures that shape our thoughts, behaviors, and, ultimately, our freedom. Comfort is one of the quietest, yet most persuasive chains in human life. It does not shout or demand, it whispers, offering warmth, security, and predictability. In its presence, questioning routines or challenging authority feels unnecessary, even irrational. People cling to familiarity because it promises safety, even if that safety is an illusion. Daily routines, commuting the same route, performing repetitive tasks, adhering to unspoken social codes, become invisible boundaries. Each small act reinforces the idea that leaving the system would be painful, inconvenient, or reckless. Over time, these choices accumulate, creating a cage constructed from convenience itself. Yet, awareness of this comfort trap sparks subtle tension. The mind begins to notice the gap between the life lived and the life imagined. Desire for freedom rises quietly, tugging at the edges of complacency. It is in this tension, the pull between ease and autonomy, that the first real cracks in obedience appear. Before we can imagine stepping outside the system, it is worth asking a simple yet profound question: why do we follow at all? Most of our actions, agreeing with authority, adhering to norms, maintaining routines, go unexamined, performed almost automatically. But beneath these habits lie motives we rarely confront. Some obey out of fear of judgment, failure, or social rejection. Others follow for reward, the promise of stability, recognition, or acceptance. Many simply act out of habit, repeating patterns learned from childhood without pausing to evaluate them. Reflecting on these motives reveals the invisible threads guiding our lives. Awareness does not immediately free us, but it loosens the hold of unconscious compliance. For the introspective mind, this questioning opens a space between the self and the system, a space where curiosity grows. And once curiosity awakens, the possibility of choosing differently becomes imaginable, planting the seeds for subtle liberation. The systems we live within are rarely chaotic or accidental. They are intricate, woven together with rules, customs, and expectations that operate quietly yet powerfully. Laws dictate the boundaries of acceptable behavior, often enforced not only by authority but by collective acceptance. Social norms guide interaction, shaping what is praised, tolerated, or condemned. Even education, which promises knowledge and empowerment, subtly teaches compliance and deference to established hierarchies. These structures operate like invisible currents beneath a calm surface. Most people navigate them without awareness, believing their choices are independent, when in truth they are often responding to unseen pressures. The architecture of society encourages conformity at every level, from professional hierarchies to cultural rituals, reinforcing patterns that sustain the system over generations. For the analytical mind, seeing these invisible forces is both enlightening and disquieting. It reveals that resistance is not simply a matter of willpower, it requires understanding how deeply the system influences thought, behavior, and perception. Recognizing this complexity awakens a subtle urgency, a curiosity to explore how one might act differently within these invisible confines, without immediately rebelling. Humans are deeply social creatures, wired to observe and imitate the behavior of those around them. From early childhood, we learn that acceptance often depends on aligning with the group. This tendency, known as social proof, quietly shapes decisions, opinions, and actions. We follow not always because we believe, but because we want to belong, to avoid scrutiny, or simply to feel safe. In modern life, herd mentality manifests in countless ways. We adopt fashions, endorse trends, and even echo political or cultural opinions without critically examining them, guided more by the visible behavior of others than by our own independent judgment. Social media amplifies this effect, creating constant feedback loops where conformity is rewarded with likes, shares, and approval, while dissent risks isolation or ridicule. The power of the herd is subtle yet profound. Even those who consider themselves independent can fall into its patterns, convinced their choices are autonomous. Recognizing this psychological trap illuminates why breaking free from the system feels difficult. Awareness alone does not free us, but it allows the reflective mind to question, step back, and begin discerning where genuine choice ends and unconscious imitation begins. Fear is one of the most powerful yet invisible forces that binds people to the system. Unlike overt control, it rarely announces itself. Instead, it seeps quietly into decisions, whispering warnings of punishment, ridicule, or failure. The mere thought of judgment, whether from peers, employers, or society at large, can be enough to deter deviation from accepted norms. Consider the workplace, where employees follow procedures not only out of duty but to avoid criticism. In social contexts, people suppress opinions, ideas, or behaviors that might provoke disapproval. Even personal ambitions are tempered, weighed against imagined consequences of failure or rejection. Fear, though silent, acts as a constant regulator, reinforcing compliance without visible chains. The reflective observer begins to notice the subtle ways fear shapes thought. It explains why people obey even when they recognize injustice or inefficiency, why routines are maintained, and why questioning authority feels risky. Recognizing fear's pervasive influence does not instantly free the mind, but it offers a kind of empowerment. Awareness becomes the first act of defiance, a mental space where curiosity sparks, and the possibility of choosing differently starts to emerge. Once obedience becomes routine, it develops its own momentum, a force that carries people forward without conscious effort. Daily habits, professional obligations, and social expectations accumulate over time, forming patterns that are difficult to disrupt. Even those who recognize the invisible chains often feel powerless to act against them, trapped by the weight of years spent following. Relationships also reinforce this inertia. Friends, family, and colleagues become part of a network that subtly pressures conformity. Approving nods and shared routines reward compliance, while deviation risks tension or isolation. Over time, the comfort of predictability outweighs the desire for independence, making the thought of stepping outside the system daunting. Societal rewards, promotion, recognition, stability further solidify this momentum. Each small success tied to compliance reinforces the behavior, creating a feedback loop that convinces the individual obedience is not only safe but advantageous. Awareness of these forces can bring frustration, but it also sparks curiosity. Understanding why breaking free feels nearly impossible is the first step toward imagining a path through the inertia, hinting at the subtle strategies for liberation that lie ahead. Even when people sense that their actions conflict with their values, the mind finds ways to justify obedience. This is cognitive dissonance at work, a psychological mechanism that reduces internal tension by reshaping perception rather than behavior. The discomfort of acting against personal beliefs is softened with rationalizations, allowing compliance to continue almost seamlessly. Consider someone who takes a job that stifles creativity or ethical standards. They may tell themselves it is temporary, necessary, or the responsible choice. Social conformity works similarly. A person may disagree with popular opinion but convinces themselves that dissent would be pointless or even dangerous. In both cases, rationalization preserves comfort while reinforcing habitual obedience. The subtle power of this mechanism is that it makes the system feel natural, even moral. Individuals come to believe that following rules, routines, and expectations is the right path, even when it suppresses curiosity or independence. For the reflective viewer, noticing these patterns in oneself sparks awareness. It exposes the hidden mental chains maintaining servitude, creating anticipation for strategies to regain autonomy without ignoring the complexity of life's choices. Stepping outside the system is rarely a purely intellectual act. Social consequences loom large, shaping behavior in ways that are often more powerful than laws or rules. The fear of isolation, ridicule, or failure quietly enforces conformity, discouraging deviation even among those who are fully aware of the system's constraints. Rebellion, in any form, carries tangible and invisible costs. A colleague who challenges workplace norms may face subtle ostracism or stalled promotion. A friend who expresses unpopular opinions risks criticism or social exclusion. Even within families, questioning traditions can create tension or estrangement. These social pressures act as invisible walls, reminding individuals that freedom is rarely without consequence. For the reflective viewer, understanding these costs brings empathy and clarity. It explains why intelligent, self-aware people often remain obedient despite discomfort or moral conflict. Recognizing the emotional weight of rebellion also heightens curiosity. If freedom carries such costs, what paths exist that allow subtle autonomy without total disruption? This tension sets the stage for exploring Nietzschean philosophy and strategies for mental liberation, where courage is measured not in dramatic gestures but in small, deliberate acts of self-determination. Nietzsche's concept of self-overcoming begins with the recognition that true freedom is not found in external circumstances, but within the mind. It is the act of transcending the expectations, norms, and judgments imposed by the herd, cultivating autonomy over one's values and choices. This process is not sudden or dramatic, it is internal, gradual, and profoundly personal. Self-overcoming requires observing one's own habits, fears, and impulses without judgment. It involves questioning why we think, act, and feel in certain ways, and deciding which influences deserve attention and which should be discarded. By doing so, individuals reclaim authority over their inner world, reducing the power of external systems over their lives. This internal revolution is subtle but transformative. Whereas the herd accepts preordained roles, self-overcoming allows a person to craft a life aligned with conscious values rather than inherited expectations. For the reflective viewer, this concept sparks curiosity. If obedience is learned, can it also be unlearned? Nietzsche's philosophy frames liberation not as rebellion against others, but as the cultivation of independence within oneself, a quiet, deliberate empowerment that challenges conformity at its core. Discomfort is often the first signal that we are encountering growth, even if it feels unsettling. It appears as unease, doubt, or tension, nudging the mind to notice patterns that have gone unquestioned. While most people avoid discomfort, interpreting it as danger or failure, it can be reframed as a guide, a subtle indicator of where the familiar no longer serves us. Facing fear, isolation, or uncertainty does not require dramatic action. Reflection alone can reveal the ways in which routines and expectations have dulled our awareness. By observing discomfort, the mind begins to distinguish between real threats and the psychological chains created by habit and social pressure. This mental reframing turns unease into insight, and anxiety into curiosity. For the reflective viewer, embracing discomfort becomes an exercise in understanding rather than confrontation. It signals where internal autonomy can be strengthened and where the herd's influence has seeped unnoticed. By recognizing these moments, one prepares for subtle resistance and thoughtful self-direction. In this sense, discomfort is not punishment, it is the quiet pathway through which the mind begins to reclaim freedom and self-mastery. Conscious choice begins with awareness. Noticing the values that guide decisions and distinguishing those that are truly yours from those inherited from society. Most people accept norms, rules, and expectations without examination, allowing obedience to become automatic. By contrast, choosing values intentionally is a deliberate act of mental liberation, a way to regain authority over one's own life. This process requires asking difficult questions. Which beliefs serve me? Which are merely echoes of others' expectations? Which actions align with my principles, and which are performed out of habit or fear? Reflection sharpens the mind's ability to detect subtle influence, revealing where conformity has quietly dictated behavior. Choosing values consciously does not demand immediate rebellion against the system. Instead, it establishes an internal framework that guides thought and action, granting subtle power over circumstances that once felt controlling. The mind begins to operate with intentionality, and the individual recognizes that obedience is not a default state but a choice, one that can be accepted or rejected based on reasoned reflection. For the introspective viewer, this awareness primes curiosity for practical ways to navigate the system while maintaining autonomy, a bridge to subtle liberation explored in the final chapter. Liberation does not always arrive through grand gestures, often, it begins in the smallest choices. Each decision we make, no matter how mundane, carries the potential to challenge unconscious obedience. Choosing how we spend our time, what we read, or even how we respond to social expectations can quietly affirm autonomy. Micro-decisions, pausing before agreeing with the crowd, reflecting before acting on routine impulses, questioning assumptions, accumulate over time. They build awareness and create subtle cracks in the structures that guide habitual behavior. These small acts are not dramatic, yet their cumulative effect strengthens the mind's capacity for conscious choice. For the pragmatic viewer, recognizing the power in minor deviations is empowering. It shows that resistance need not be confrontational or visible to others. By attending to these tiny opportunities, individuals begin to reclaim agency, realizing that freedom can be nurtured quietly, thoughtfully, and deliberately, one conscious choice at a time. Questioning authority need not be loud or confrontational. It can begin as a daily mental exercise. Treating rules, directives, and societal expectations as optional rather than absolute encourages critical reflection. Over time, this habit trains the mind to evaluate rather than comply automatically. Small, consistent acts of inquiry, asking why a rule exists, considering whether a norm serves your values, reflecting on the motives behind advice, slowly cultivate independence of thought. Authority becomes a lens for understanding rather than a command to obey. This shift changes perception subtly but profoundly, making the familiar feel negotiable and the unquestioned visible. For the intellectually curious viewer, the process sparks ongoing engagement. Each reflection builds on the last, creating loops of awareness that reinforce cognitive liberation. By questioning daily, obedience is transformed from default behavior into conscious choice. The mind learns that compliance is not inevitable, and curiosity becomes a quiet, persistent force for autonomy. Building a personal philosophy begins with defining the principles that matter most, independent of societal expectations. It is an internal framework that guides decisions, shapes reactions, and anchors thought, offering stability in a world that often imposes external pressures. This philosophy does not require grand declarations or rigid rules. It can emerge quietly, through reflection on values, priorities, and long-term goals. By consciously choosing what matters, individuals create a compass for behavior that is not dictated by trends, authority, or social approval. For the philosophically inclined viewer, this practice brings a sense of empowerment and calm. Actions become aligned with deliberate choice rather than default obedience. The internal narrative, the story one tells oneself about why they act, becomes a tool for subtle liberation. With a personal philosophy, the mind can navigate external pressures thoughtfully, maintaining autonomy while engaging fully with the world, without needing overt rebellion to assert independence. Self-overcoming is not a destination but a lifelong journey. It is the continuous practice of observing one's thoughts, questioning habitual patterns, and making conscious choices that align with personal values. Each day presents new opportunities to notice where the mind has slipped into automatic compliance and gently redirect it toward awareness. This ongoing process requires patience and subtlety. Liberation does not announce itself with dramatic gestures, it unfolds quietly through repeated attention to small decisions, reflection on motives, and the cultivation of internal autonomy. Over time, these conscious acts accumulate, creating a durable sense of freedom that persists even within complex social systems. For the reflective viewer, this conclusion emphasizes that empowerment is gradual and self-sustaining. By embracing continuous self-overcoming, the mind learns to navigate influence and expectation with intentionality. Liberation becomes less about escaping the system and more about cultivating a resilient, autonomous inner life, leaving curiosity and reflection to carry forward beyond the video itself.